In this video, we are going to learn how we can run the Ionic application on Android and iOS devices. So we'll start by building and running the application for Android, and we'll be using an Android emulator to do that. And once we do that, we'll move on to iOS. And for iOS, we'll be using the iOS simulator. To follow along in this lesson, make sure that you have installed and set up Android Studio and Xcode on your system. The first step in building an application for either platforms is adding the platform using the Ionic CLI to our Ionic application. The command to do that is Ionic Cordova platform add followed by the name of the platform. So the name of the platform can either be Android or it can be iOS. If you pass in the keyword Android as the name of the platform, the Android platform will be added to your Ionic project. If you pass in iOS, the iOS platform will be downloaded and added to your Ionic project. You can go ahead and build your application for respective platforms. The command to do that is Ionic Cordova build Android. Or if you want to build for iOS, the command to do that is Ionic Cordova build iOS. As you can see, you are free to pass in the name of either platforms. Once you have built the application for either platforms, the last step is to run the application. To do that, the command is Ionic Cordova run followed by the name of the platform, which can be Android or iOS. For Android this works, but for iOS it gets a little trickier. Let's have a look at how to achieve this for Android first, and then we'll move on to iOS. So here I have the Ionic project opened inside Visual Studio Code, and now I'm going to type in the commands to add the Android platform to this project. So I'll just go ahead and type in Ionic Cordova platform add Android. This command requires that you are connected to internet and might take some time depending upon the speed of your internet connection. So be patient while this command is executing, and once this finishes, we'll move on to building our Android application. This command also creates a new folder called Platforms inside your Ionic project, and inside this folder you'll see another folder called Android, which contains the Android build of your application. Similarly, when you will add the iOS platform, a folder called iOS will be created inside the Platforms folder, which will contain the iOS build for your Ionic application. A new resources folder is also created, which contains the icons and splash screens for both Android and iOS. It contains the icon and splash images for various screen sizes for both Android and iOS. So if you want to have a custom icon or if you want to have a custom splash screen, make sure that you put them right here and replace the original files and then execute the build commands. So now you can see that the platform Android has been added to our Ionic application. Now we can go ahead and build this application for Android. So inside the terminal, I'll just go ahead and type in Ionic Cordova build Android. This command will build our application for Android, and once the application is built, we can simply go ahead and run the application on an emulator or on a real device. This command requires you to have Android Home and Java Home environment variables set in your system. If you haven't done so, make sure that you have set these variables before executing this command. So now you can see that the build has been completed successfully, and now that the application is built, we can go ahead and run this application on an Android emulator. If you want to test this application on your Android phone, make sure that you have USB debugging enabled on your phone and your phone is connected to your system via the USB cable. If you want to test it on an Android emulator, make sure that the Android emulator is up and running. So before we execute the next command, let's launch the emulator first. To open the emulator, open up Android Studio, and your Android Studio should look something like this when it launches for the very first time. As of now, all you need to do is get into Android Studio. So just go ahead and create a new Android project and proceed to create a new Android application. Once the application creation process finishes, Android Studio will launch and it will open your newly created Android application. we don't have to worry about this newly created application. What we are concerned about is launching the AVD manager. AVD stands for Android Virtual Device, and the AVD manager will let us run an Android emulator on a system. So here is the icon that will let us launch Android Virtual Device Manager. So click on this icon. It will open the AVD manager, and here you can see that I have an AVD created. If you do not have an AVD created, you can use this button Create Virtual Device to create a new virtual device, and then it will show up in your list. Once you have created a virtual device, hit on the play button right here, and this launches an Android emulator on your system. Once the Android emulator launches, you can go ahead and close Android Studio. And here we have our Android emulator up and running. So now that we have the Android emulator, let's go ahead and run our Ionic application that we have just built on this emulator. Let's go ahead and type in the command Ionic Cordova run Android. This command will automatically detect any connected phones, and if none is connected, then it will launch the application on the up and running emulator. As of now, I have not connected any phones to the system, so the application will launch on the emulator. And you can see that the application has been installed successfully on the system, and now it has been launched as well. Let's head back to our emulator, and on our emulator, we can actually see our application running. Now let's go ahead and run our Ionic application on an iOS simulator. To do that, we will have to execute all the same commands. So we'll start by adding the iOS platform. The command to do that is Ionic Cordova platform add iOS. And now you can see that we have a folder called iOS inside the platforms folder, which contains the iOS build for our Ionic application. The platform iOS has been added successfully to our Ionic application. Now we need to build this application for iOS. And the things get a little trickier here. For iOS, the usual command should be Ionic Cordova build iOS. But along with that, with the latest version of Xcode, we have to pass in additional parameters. And those are -- build flag, and you have to set it equal to --use modern build system, and you have to set it equal to 0. This flag is required if you are running the latest version of Xcode. However, if you are running an older version of Xcode, then you do not need to add this flag. Go ahead and press enter, and this command will build the application for iOS. And the build has succeeded. So now that the application has been built successfully for iOS, we can go ahead and run this application for iOS. To do that, we can execute the command Ionic Cordova run iOS, but this command does not work for most people. The easier way to run this application on an iOS simulator is go to the project folder, open the platforms folder, open the iOS folder, and in here you have the iOS build of your Ionic application. Open the file with the name myapp.xcodeproj, which stands for Xcode project. This file will open the project in Xcode. And once the project opens up in Xcode, you can run it on an iOS simulator. Here you can see that the current simulator, which is selected right here, is iPhone XR. You can choose a different version of simulator if you want to. For now, I'm going to run this application on the one that is selected right here. I'm just going to hit the play button right here and select run. And now you can see the iOS simulator, and once it boots up, the application will launch on the simulator. And there we have our Ionic application running on an iOS simulator. And this is how you can run your applications on Android and iOS simulators, or even on real devices. So now that we know how we can run our applications on Android and iOS devices, let's understand how an Ionic application works.